Welcome to Quick Course Digest. Today, we're diving deep into the absolutely fascinating world of criminology. In this explainer, we're going to take a journey from the most basic question you can ask, what even is a crime, all the way to the complex, competing theories that try to explain why people commit them in the first place.
All right, so here's our game plan. First, we'll tackle that fundamental question. What is crime, really? Then, we're going to look at the huge role the media plays in shaping how we all think about it. After that, we'll dig into the actual data, explore the big theories behind why crime happens, and finally, we'll see how it all comes together in the world we live in today.
So, Section 1, what is crime? Now, you might think you know the answer, right? But in criminology, that question is actually one of the most debated topics there is. It's not nearly as simple as it seems.
At the very heart of this debate, you've got two big competing ideas. On the one hand, there's the consensus model. This is the idea that we as a society pretty much agree on what's right and wrong, and our laws just reflect those shared values. Things like murder. Most of us are on the same page there. But then, on the other hand, you have the conflict model, which says, not so fast. It argues that laws are often created by the people in power to protect their own stuff and their own interests. Think about it. Laws around things like trespassing almost always favor property owners over the unhoused.
And this all leads to a really crucial point. Criminology sees crime as a social construct. What does that mean? Well, it means there's nothing baked into the universe that makes an act criminal. Instead, what we call a crime is something we, as a society, have defined. And that definition changes over time, shaped by our values, our beliefs, and, our power structures. Okay, so let's move on and see how this plays out. Because if society gets to define crime, then who shapes what society thinks? Well, more often than not, it's the media. Let's dig into how our idea of crime is shaped less by data and more by the stories we're constantly being told. The media's role is huge. It doesn't just report on crime, it frames it. It picks and chooses which stories get the spotlight and exactly how to tell them. And this can really blow certain fears out of proportion and create this really clear but often misleading divide between us, the good, law-abiding folks, and them, the criminals.
And that kind of framing can lead to this incredibly powerful thing called a moral panic. This is what happens when media coverage just ignites this widespread, sometimes totally irrational, fear about a certain group or behavior, making the actual threat seem way, way bigger than it is. It basically creates a villain for everyone to rally against. And listen, these moral panics aren't just academic concepts. They have devastating real-world consequences. The satanic panic of the 1980s is a perfect and tragic example. Media-fueled hysteria led to completely false accusations, it ruined lives, and it led to wrongful convictions, all based on a threat that was almost entirely made up. The media's influence also spills over into who we see as a victim. News coverage often really depends on whether a person fits this stereotype of the ideal victim, someone who is seen as completely innocent, vulnerable, and easy for all of us to feel sorry for. And this leads to a really stark and troubling bias that researchers call missing white woman syndrome. Just look at this slide. Cases involving missing white women get way more intense around-the-clock media attention. One study actually found that there were 3.5 times fewer stories about missing Indigenous women compared to white women in similar situations. It shows you exactly how that ideal victim narrative plays out in reality. Okay, we've spent a lot of time on perception. Let's switch gears and move from the stories to the actual statistics. How do criminologists measure crime? And what does the real data tell us about what's actually going on out there? Well, the very first thing you have to understand is this critical idea called the dark figure of crime. It's a term for all the crimes that never, ever get reported to the police. So all that official data we see, it's really just the tip of the iceberg. And the scale of this is, it's staggering. It's estimated that around 50%, that's half of all crimes, go completely unrecorded. And there are tons of reasons for this. Maybe people are scared or embarrassed, or they just think the police can't or won't do anything to help. But what it means is that our entire picture of crime, based on official stats, is fundamentally incomplete. So, when we look at the data we do have, criminologists break it into a few main categories. First up are violent crimes. These are the acts that involve force or the threat of force, things like homicide, assault, and robbery. These are the crimes that totally dominate the news headlines and our fears. Then you have property crimes. Now, statistically, These are way more common than violent crimes. This includes stuff like burglary, car theft, arson, things where the main goal isn't to hurt a person, but to take or damage their stuff.
Then there's this whole other world, white-collar and corporate crimes. We're talking about crimes committed by people in positions of power and trust. Think fraud, embezzlement, insider trading. The financial damage from these crimes can absolutely dwarf the cost of street crime, but they get way less attention. And finally, of course, you've got the modern frontier, cybercrime. This category covers everything from those phishing scams you get in your email to massive identity theft rings. Here, the internet is both the weapon and the crime scene. So we know what crime is, how it's portrayed, and how we try to measure it. Let's move to the biggest question of them all. Why? Why do people commit crimes in the first place? Criminology has been wrestling with this one for centuries. This huge debate really boils down to two great opposing schools of thought. On one side, you have the classical school, which believes that crime is a rational choice. A person weighs the pros and cons and decides to do it. But the positivist school says, hold on, it's not that simple. They argue that criminal behavior is actually determined by forces beyond our control, like our biology, our psychology, or the society we grow up in. This table does a great job of breaking down that fundamental conflict. You've got the classical school with thinkers like Beccaria focusing on deterring crime with punishment that fits the crime. Then you have the positivist school, using science to look for biological or social root causes. But look at their limitations, right? The classical school kind of ignores huge social factors like poverty, while the positivist school can sometimes feel like it's saying we have no free will at all. So for our final section, let's bring it all together. How do these really foundational, almost old school ideas still help us understand crime right here in the 21st century? Well, take modern white-collar crime. In 2022, consumers lost a jaw-dropping $8.8 billion to fraud. That's a 30% jump from the year before. Now, this isn't crime that's easily explained by biology. A lot of it fits the classical school's model perfectly. It's a rational, calculated choice to get ahead. It just goes to show how these old theories are still incredibly relevant.
And that brings us full circle, right back to where we started. We've seen that the definition of crime isn't set in stone. It's fluid. It's constantly being shaped by society, the media, and by power. Which leaves us with one last provocative question to think about. What common behaviors that we all do today might a future society look back on and decide were criminal? The answer is far from certain.